Trauma has many, many implications, but fundamentally, it's a wound that constricts you and disconnects you from yourself. Trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happened inside you. You're suffering, but you don't need to. You just have to look at the bigger picture.
From To Be Magnetic, this is the Expanded Podcast with your host, Lacey Phillips. As the leading destination for neural manifestation, we dispel the woo-woo in order to help you create real, tangible results based on neuroplasticity, psychology, epigenetics, and energetics. Our goal is to normalize the practice of manifestation and empower you to get into the driver's seat of your life in order to manifest the experiences, relationships, and things that most align with your authenticity. Part of our manifestation process entails expanding past your limiting subconscious beliefs. Therefore, by tuning into this podcast with interviews from experts, thought leaders, spiritual teachers, scientists, and those with neural manifestation success stories, you're starting the process of expanding your subconscious in order to see to believe that anything you desire is possible. And by pressing play, the process begins.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Expanded Podcast. Jessica here. I am so excited for today's guest. It was a true manifestation come through to have this person on. We have on Dr. Gabor Mate. Dr. Gabor is a renowned speaker, best-selling author, highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, stress, ADHD, childhood development, and trauma. You may recognize him from some of his best-selling books in the realm of Hungry Ghost, Close Encounters with Addiction, When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress, Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Their Peers, and his latest book, which hit the shelves this Tuesday, September 13th, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. Dr. Gabor has been on our guest of list that we've wanted to have on Expanded pretty much since I've joined To Be Magnetic. And it is such an honor to have him on today and speaking with Lacey. And their conversation really just highlights how much his work and experience as a psychologist for 20 plus years in his own practice and his own sort of findings and different research studies from working with different peers who are experts in the industry, how trauma really does wreak havoc on the body. And there is a massive mind-body connection going on when we have trauma. In the episode, they really touch on some of the pillars to look for, the ways that we might have developed coping mechanisms that are no longer helpful and actually an indicator that we are more likely to have chronic illness. Some of those things that you will find in the episode are a lot of putting someone else's needs before yourself, repressing a healthy emotion of your own anger. These are things that a lot of us probably identify with. And so it's so important to bring it to the surface that the research does show the connection between the mind and the body and why it is so important to listen to our bodies and the signals that it is giving us, even in a very subtle way. And even rooting down to our manifestation practices, Dr. Gabor talks about the impact of losing our authenticity and the moments in childhood where we may have deviated from our authenticity in order to find a healthy attachment to a caregiver, and how we can start to use neuroplasticity to rebuild that authenticity within us. It is such a good episode. And honestly, listening back, during the edit process, it just got me so excited because this exact thing is why I love this work, because it allows you a tool to dive into your own healing. It allows you to pull back the curtain of why things are operating the way they are and to redefine the stories that have happened to us in our life and make beautiful moments out of it to create and inspire hope. So for anyone that you know who is just starting on their healing journey, or they're going through a really difficult situation, whether it's a health, mental illness, trauma, I feel like this episode will kind of crack them open to see that there is another way and that healing is so, so possible. So feel free to share this with friends and family. I know this is one where I'm definitely going to sneak out to some family members who may not be familiar with this type of work. I hope this episode sparks conversation, insight, and interest in a whole plethora of different things in the healing world. So without further ado, enjoy the episode.
And now a word from our partners. Seed Probiotic, who we have partnered with now for about a year and love and are obsessed with, and we think it's obviously the best probiotic on the market, has finally come out with Pediatric Daily Symbiotic, which is for children ages 3 to 17, and it has 9 probiotic strains and a fiber-based prebiotic. The beautiful thing is there's no refrigeration necessary. So for us, we're considering going to Europe in the fall. We're also about to take a huge road trip up to the Pacific Northwest. So for someone like us who's on the go and about our land, no refrigeration necessary is really, really appealing, especially in the form of a children's probiotic. And for those of you who have really, really, really sensitive children, it's really beautiful because it's free from 14 classes of allergens and additives, which we know are really rampant now. So it's completely sugar-free, soy-free, gluten-free, dairy-free, nut-free, and sesame-free. And if anybody has a picky eater or a texture picky kid, it's really cool because you actually just tear open their extremely sustainable packaging and you can add it to any smoothie, any drink, yogurt, whatever you're going to be feeding them and mix it right in. And the beautiful thing is it's part of the entire system, like all of Seed Probiotic, where it's completely engineered to survive. So one of the only probiotics out there that is scientifically proven to make it all the way to the targeted area in your gut. And last but not least, there are 5 grams of prebiotic fiber per serving. So for myself, who is gearing up to start weaning soon in preparation for the next pregnancy, I'm sitting here wondering where the probiotics are going to come from for Teddy. You know, my milk is obviously so rich in probiotics, but this is the beautiful, beautiful next step as we enter the world of health, digestion, and longevity. So for anybody who wants to try it, use the code all caps TBM15 for 15% off the first month. And again, that's all caps TBM15 for 15% off the first month. And those of you that have kids and teens out there, this is also wonderful for those ages. So thank you, Seed, for creating yet another perfect product. I'm actually really pumped to talk about this at this very moment because I'm coming off of a very long weekend where Max was sick all weekend. And then after that, our other support in our household went down from the cold that he had. However, Teddy and I never got sick. And when somebody gets sick in our house, what I do is I get out one of our big ceramic bowls and I put everything in it that they need to use, like all the little, wellness goodies. And I was looking at the bowl that I put together and it was primarily Beekeeper's Natural. And I'm just so astounded by how they keep putting out incredible products. So what I used the entire time while Max was sick was the throat spray every single day. And I'm actually really jazzed because Teddy can start it too, which he's very close to. And for extra support in my nasal passages, because it does have the propolis, though it also has antihistamine protection, but I was primarily doing it for the propolis so that it was my nose and my throat were completely covered. So I used their nasal spray, I used the throat spray, and then in Max's bowl, I had the throat spray and I had the soothing lozenges. Because how incredible that these are made with propolis, but they also have added vitamin D and zinc and honey. It just feels like an herbalist waiting for you to support you in a bag. And then Max's big move when he's sick is to use the steam shower. So he uses that, but my big move is to really sweat deeply in a hot, hot bath. It's really cute because Teddy will help me pick some mugwort and sages off of our land and throw it in the bath with me. And so that's how I was beating it as well, was sweating out. And there have been multiple times because, this company is so generous and has sent us product to try, of course, before we talk about it. And beyond that, I don't like to wait for anything. So many times I'm out buying the superfood honey myself. Certainly once a week to 2 weeks, I'm out buying the propolis. And right now, if I were to open up our medicine cabinet, you would see about 5 of the throat sprays lined up because I like to have one every single place. And certainly when we're traveling, because I use it every single day. So it's a company I never get bored of talking about. I really believe in them. I love them. I use them. So if you would like to try Beekeepers Natural, go ahead and use the code all caps TBM for 25% off. Again, that's all caps TBM for 25% off. Good luck during this fall and winter season. All right, on to the episode. And welcome. I have to say on a personal note, this is one of the more meaningful conversations that I'll have. I've been a tremendous fan of your work for so long, having grown up around a lot of addiction and child of an alcoholic. It was interesting when I first stumbled onto your work, I'd have to say it was probably about 10 years ago, maybe 7. I was like, finally, it's so in alignment with everything my heart truly understands. And I think the main model that most of my family members had access to was primarily 12-step. And I was like, but there's childhood trauma, and exactly. And coming from a mother who has Crohn's, colitis, ADHD, wow, and has, suffered from alcoholism, this will be a very, very potent conversation. So welcome.
Well, thank you. Nice to be here.
And I certainly have studied, much of everything we'll talk about today, but I really want to present it in the most basic way possible for the new listener. And I think one of the beautiful ways I love how you explain, if you would, for the audience is what is trauma?
Yes. So trauma comes from a Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is a wound that you've sustained, which can be obviously physical, but it can also be psychological, emotional. So trauma is a wound that you've suffered, which that means that trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happened inside you. So that if you hit your head with a hammer, that's the traumatic event, but the trauma is the ongoing concussion or ongoing effects that you have afterwards. That's important to understand, because if trauma is what happened to you a long time ago, there's nothing you can do about it. It happened. But if trauma is the wound that's inside you as a result, that wound couldn't be healed at any time. So this is both an accurate definition and it's also a very positive one. Now, trauma manifests in a number of ways. When it happens in childhood, either bad things happen to a child that shouldn't have, neglect or violence in a family, or a parent being addicted, or a parent being mentally ill. A child can be wounded by that. But the child can also be wounded not by things happening that shouldn't have, but by things not happening that should have. In other words, you can wound a child by not meeting their basic needs. And human children have needs to be accepted and loved for exactly who they are, to be seen for who they are, to be heard, to have the freedom to experience all their emotions, from pain to grief to rage to joy. And in a lot of families, children are not being done bad things to, but their needs aren't being met. So in this society, a lot of children are traumatized, even in families where there's no overt, externally identifiable, terrible things going on. Now, if I just conclude by saying that the impacts of trauma, the biggest one is a disconnection from yourself, from your feelings, even from your body. And that has a defensive function, because if a child is experiencing a lot of distress or pain, emotionally, psychologically, and if there's nobody there to hold them and to understand them and to support them in their pain, it becomes unbearable. So it's a survival mechanism on the part of the organism to disconnect from all that pain, from all that distress. And that disconnection from the self is the biggest impact of trauma. And it has all kinds of implications for physical and mental health. Trauma, of course, also gives you a lot of pain that you might try and soothe throughout your life by addictive behaviors or trying to be nice to people so they'll love you. So trauma has many, many implications, but fundamentally, it's a wound that constricts you and disconnects you from yourself.
And then the other thing that I wanted to lead into that I think is really impactful in your work, you really focus on three important aspects to the human experience: early childhood, certainly addiction, and the body, illness. Mm-hmm. And I think a really important piece that you just touched on was the child needing to belong. And I'm just so curious about the journey. You sometimes reference, for instance, the Aborigines and attachment. Let's talk about what a healthy experience looks like for someone in, say, our community who's going to be reparenting themselves and reparenting their wounds. What does a healthy experience look like?
You know, if you wanted to study a baboon or a whale or a zebra, you wouldn't study them in a zoo or an aquarium. You'd study them out in nature as they evolved in interaction with their environment. Now, same with human beings. And human beings evolved for millions and then hundreds of thousands of years, including our own species, which has been around about 150, 200,000 years. We lived out in nature in small communities, in nomadic small communities, hunter-gatherer groups. Now, Jean Liedloff, who wrote this wonderful book called The Continuum Concept, where she studied with an Aboriginal tribe in the Amazon jungle in South America, she says that every creature has expectations based on their evolutionary past. So every organ and every organism has certain expectations. Our lungs are an expectation for oxygen. If it wasn't for oxygen, we would never have evolved lungs. So lungs not just have an expectation for oxygen, they are an expectation for oxygen. By analogy, any infant of a mammal, whether it's a baboon, a rat, or a whale, is born with certain expectations, which is nurturing, consistently available, unconditionally loving, supportive parenting in community. This is how we evolved. So the human being is born with that expectation of unconditional loving acceptance by adults who are around all the time throughout the child's infancy and at development and adolescence, and who are furthermore form part of a collaborative communal environment. That's our expectation. That's what it looks like. So what a healthy environment looks like is a mother who's supported throughout her pregnancy by the group, a birth that is non-interfered with unless it's medically absolutely necessary, infancy where the child is held, not put down, not made to sleep by themselves, not made to cry it out, but held through all their distress and through all their joy, where there is lots of supportive adults around, and when the parents themselves are supported by the community. That's what human beings are born as expectations for. In our society, parents with all the love in their hearts and with the best of intentions have great difficulty meeting those needs because parenting has become an isolated enterprise. Most parents, even if they're in a couple, they're in an isolated nuclear family couple, far away very often from their extended family, not that engaged with fellow parents and community, often under economic stress or the stress of more overt pressures such as, economic struggles or racism and so on. And so that you have is isolated, stressed parents who, with the best of goodwill, have great, and plus there's so much bad parenting advice out there. There's so much parenting advice that tells parents to go against their own instincts, not to pick up the child when they're crying, to let the child sleep it out, to let the child cry it out. Try and tell a mother baboon to let the baby cry it out without picking them up. Try and tell a mother bear not to attend to the distress of the infant. But this is what we're training parents to do. What we're having is a totally unnatural environment, and naturally children's needs not being met, and increasingly in an isolating, increasingly stressful and fractured society, now we have the phenomena of more and more kids being diagnosed with this and that other disorder or problem or so-called mental disease. when in fact all that's happening, and I make this point in my book, The Myth of Normal, all that's happening is that these so-called diagnoses are normal responses to what is an abnormal culture. The child-raising environment has become so abnormal, and there's a wonderful psychologist, Darshia Narvaez, who taught at Notre Dame University. She says that we have become species atypical. She says we've become foreign to our own species. We're the only creature on Earth that creates environments almost purposefully that goes against its own needs, and especially the needs of the developing child.
I completely agree. And in the book, The Myth of Normal, you touch on the HPA axis, which is responsible for helping our brains regulate stress. Like, even reflecting on my experience, we're providing all of that to my 16-month-old. That's all we can each do. I'm just trying each day to break cycles, and do better. But I look at my experience, it's so privileged, especially from what I come from, and we can provide that. I'm always home, multiple adults in the house, all,
Wow.
it's the whole thing, it's attachment parent. We're doing the thing, and we're certainly not doing it perfectly, but
Hey, will you be my mom?
I know. If I could, I was watching the documentary earlier today, the documentary that's made on you. That was going to be one of my big questions, and I digress, and I'll get back. But the work that you do, it would break my heart every day, every single person that I encountered that didn't have that experience, because I'm so sensitive to a child's needs. And I know it's the foundation of everything in changing our society. How do you do it? And how do we all start to do it on a greater scale? And then we'll get back to my original question.
Well, look, the first thing we have to realize is that what we take to be normal in our society is both unnatural and unhealthy. So really, we have to let go of this illusion of normalcy and just realize that all the problems that we're seeing. There was an article in the New York Times 2 days ago on the front page about a teenager who's on 10 different psychiatric medications. 10 different psychiatric medications. And this is not an unusual phenomena. But there's nothing in the article that in any way recognizes the developmental basis of that young person's mental distress. It's all seen as pathology to be fixed with pills. And so we have to understand that given the current environment, what we're seeing is a perfectly natural response to completely unnatural circumstances. We have to begin with that awareness. Now, many steps will follow, but without that awareness, we can't make a move.
I agree. Yeah, and that's a bigger conversation. But yes, and you just highlighted that really well, the HPA axis. So let's talk about, many people listening at this moment did not receive everything you talked about. And how can we get back to, in our later years, learning how to calm and regulate that?
Yes. So what usually happens for most people, and certainly for myself, both as an individual, as a physician, and also as a parent, is that you start realizing that things aren't working. So in my case, I was a successful doctor, had a good reputation in the community, but I was really unhappy and depressed. I loved my kids. I would have thrown myself into a fire for them, but unfortunately, they never needed me to throw myself into a fire. They just needed me to be there as a calm, self-regulated, emotionally present adult, which I wasn't capable of doing. So the travails and, I might say, sufferings of my own children acted for me as a big wake-up call. So fundamentally, how do we get there? Most of us, unfortunately, and that's just the way it is, I don't recommend it, but most of us, unfortunately, have to suffer a bit or see suffering around us, and then we start asking questions. So that's usually the route to transformation. I don't, again, recommend it. And certainly, if we can wake up without suffering, so much the better. But most of us, we're stubborn. We don't get it until something knocks us on the head and says, "Wake up, human being."
Yeah, we talk about that a lot, as a rock bottom experience. And I think about this often. I think you're explaining it now, but in your work, especially as of recently, and really taking a lot of inventory with a lot of people, when do you see that like, I think of my mom, for instance. She's struggling because of everything we've just talked about. And her childhood experience was the youngest of 5, an alcoholic father, a mother who was very religious and cold. And she even will say openly, she said, I mean, my mom loved me because she had to, but I don't think that she liked me. It's everything that we talk about, and has Crohn's, colitis, ADHD, and suffers in and out of addiction. For her, taking the first step to unraveling that and that process, when do you really see? Is it just the rock bottom, or where do you see the success start to happen?
Well, rock bottom is not enough, because people not only have to suffer, they also have to see a possibility of transformation.
Got it.
Now, for example, take your mother's Crohn's disease. There's a lot of research, and certainly I've seen this all the time as a doctor. Crohn's is specifically related to childhood trauma and stress, long-term stress. How do we treat Crohn's disease? It's an inflammation of the intestine. We treat it with stress hormones, steroids. But none of the doctors that your mother saw would ever have asked her, what trauma did you have as a child? What stresses are you carrying in the present? And how can we help you let go of those stressful patterns imposed by your childhood trauma that are making your organism sick? Because the physicians, despite all the science that has highlighted voluminously the relationship between mind and body and the relationship between trauma, stress, and physiological illness, most physicians are not trained to understand this. They don't even see it when it's staring them in the face. So what your mother would have needed is somebody to say to her, listen, you're suffering, but you don't need to. You just have to look at the bigger picture. So somebody has to come along and say that. And unfortunately, people go to physicians with their ADHD or with their Crohn's or their colitis or their asthma or their chronic skin conditions or their multiple sclerosis or their depression. And all they're seen as are biological organisms with diseased organs. The whole human being in the context of her life is never even seen or addressed. And so it's in the absence of that your poor mom has not had the support to move past those patterns.
100%. And that really takes us into the mind-body connection of your prior work and this new book. How can we start to investigate what our bodies are saying and trace it back to emotional traumas, but actually starting to see results and healing?
Begin by listening to the body, so that if you have an illness and if there's a flare-up of, say, your rheumatoid arthritis or your colitis or your multiple sclerosis, or your depression deepens or whatever, you can ask yourself, what stresses were happening to me prior to the flare-up? You can let the body teach you by listening to it. On a daily basis, you can tune into the body and say, what is my body trying to tell me? Because the body talks to us all the time. It'll give you headaches. It'll make you'll have fatigue. You'll have dry mouth. You'll have trouble sleeping. You'll have cramps in your belly. You'll have intestinal, digestional difficulties. You'll have low back pain. You'll have anxiety. You have muscle spasm. The body's talking to us all the time. When I talked about trauma and how it disconnects, that's the whole problem, is because in childhood, in order not to suffer, we disconnect from our bodies. Now as adults, we don't know how to listen to it. So now we have to just relearn, make a daily practice of listening to our bodies.
Absolutely. And I love that. I love when the body's communicating to actually really, really listen to what it's saying. Furthermore, for everybody listening and their interest is really perked now who may be suffering, talk about the personality traits you've noticed the most in people with chronic illness, that it's very socially acceptable traits.
Well, not only acceptable, but even considered admirable, which is a real tragedy, actually. So in my medical work as a family physician, working with people with all manner of conditions, and also in palliative care as director of a palliative care unit here in Vancouver, working with dying people, I noticed there were certain traits that kept repeating themselves like a pattern in people with chronic illness. And they included, saliently, the automatic and kind of compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own. So I give the example of a woman, a real story of a woman who's diagnosed with breast cancer, and her first thought is, how will I support my husband through this? So that's the first trait, this automatic concern for the needs of others, ignoring your own. The second one is identification with duty, role, and responsibility. Now, people that do that are glorified in our society, but they very often do it at the expense of ignoring their own needs and their own body signals. So rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility. That's the second, sort of a multitasking, I can do everything for everybody ethic. That's the second. The third is key here, which is the repression of healthy anger. Now, we have a circuit in our brain for anger. It's a good thing. You try and walk into an animal's territory, you want to see what healthy anger looks like, you'll see it. Healthy anger says, you're in my space, get out. Now, in early childhood, when the parents don't know how to handle the child's anger, the child gets the message that if I'm angry, good kids don't get angry. The message is angry kids don't get loved. The child's desperate to be loved, so they'll automatically, unwittingly and unconsciously repress their anger. That repression of emotion is the most constant trait in people that I've seen with Crohn's, colitis, ALS, multiple sclerosis, autoimmune disease of all kinds, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on. So that's the third characteristic. The fourth personality trait, and I have to also put in parentheses here, I'm not talking about inborn character traits. Nobody's born with these. These are personality traits that we develop in response to our environment. They come along as coping mechanisms, but then they cause trouble later on. And the fourth of them is a belief that you're responsible for what other people feel and that you must never disappoint anybody. Now, these traits together impose tremendous stress on the organism, and because of the mind-body unity that you mentioned, they also have an impact on the body's immune system, hormonal apparatus, nervous system, in other words, our entire physiology. So again, we're not blaming anybody for being ill. Nobody chooses to be that way. These are all developed as coping patterns to help the child fit in with their environment, because the environment didn't accept them for who they were, so they had to make themselves acceptable by developing these traits. These traits will lead you into illness.
Boy, how many of those I identify with? It's like, what I'm really hearing here is codependency is like the big piece.
Well, yeah, it can show up as codependency.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly been the thing that I think is at the root of, as being a child of an alcoholic. I'm sure many people listening are like, yep, check, check, check. And what I really love in your work, it's just so distilled. And to me makes a lot of sense, especially for people who are reparenting themselves or are currently parenting children or are in a role of importance in a child's life, but the clash between attachment and authenticity.
Yes.
And how it plays such an important role in all of this.
It's key to understanding our culture, actually. So children are born with, as we've already talked about, this need to attach to parents for the sake of sheer survival. Not just human children, all mammals, even birds, are born with that need to attach for the sake of being taken care of, or for the sake of taking care of the other. So that's the attachment relationship, without which life is impossible. But we have another need as well, which is what I call authenticity, which isn't somehow a fancy-dancy New Age concept. It's being authentic, auto being the self, being connected to yourself, to your gut feelings. And this is an evolutionary dictated need as well, because imagine a creature out in nature who's not connected with their gut feelings. How long do they survive? So that these are two needs dictated by nature. Now, if I can be authentic and stay attached, in other words, I can be my authentic self and be accepted and loved and received and valued by my family and community, then I can have the attachment. I can also have the authenticity. But in this society, for all kinds of reasons, some of which we've touched upon, so many kids get the message that if I'm authentic, if I have my authentic feelings, I'm not acceptable to the people on whose my life depends. Therefore, children automatically and unwittingly surrender authenticity for the sake of staying attached. Unfortunately, these childhood coping mechanisms become ingrained, and they help to form what we call the personality. And then throughout adulthood, we continue not to be able to say no to the world's expectations and demands to be who they want us to be. And this society is past master at creating images and identities that people want to emulate and be like in order to be accepted, in order to be attractive, in order to be valued. So we spend our lives not being ourselves, being inauthentic, until that inauthenticity shows up in a form of suffering. And then we have to ask, how do we get back to ourselves? But that tension between authenticity, feeling what you feel, saying what you believe, being who you are, on the one hand, and the attachment of being accepted and loved, in this society, it's really a tragic tension. And very often, authenticity will lose out.
I mean, that's at the root of everything we believe in and I believe in my work. Is all of our work is just trying to heal, to get back to our true, whole, worthy authenticity. And I just really, really hope everybody, hears that. That's just, it's so, so big. So I'm quickly interrupting this episode to invite you, if you're ready to start your manifestation journey, or if anything you've heard in our manifestation episodes has piqued your interest, to begin. We have a la carte workshops in everything from the basics bundle, which is what we recommend to everyone who starts. It's the formula that actually teaches you how to manifest, unblocked inner child, and unblocked shadow. We also have a la carte workshops on love and money. But the real gem is the Pathway membership, because it encompasses every single workshop we have. It's a year-long membership with full access to the few a la carte offerings we have, and exclusive workshops not available anywhere else, such as the daily practice, which is what everybody in the Pathway uses, hopefully at least 3 times a week to daily, in order to truly create the new neural pathways that one needs in order to manifest, and houses the library of our deep imaginings, which is our unique hypnosis process that allows you to get into your subconscious and overwrite those old neural pathways, creating the new ones. You can use our special code EXPANDED, all caps, EXPANDED, to receive $20 off your first a la carte workshop purchase, or $20 off your first month of the Pathway. Again, that's all caps, EXPANDED, EXPANDED. Okay, now back to the episode.
I know that for people that are not familiar with the vast literature on the unity of mind and body, this may sound strange, but both my experience as a physician and also my reading of the really vast scientific literature has convinced me that this tension between inauthenticity and attachment is at the heart of most chronic illness. And specifically, if you look at women in our society, do you know that women have, when it comes to autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis and scleroderma and lupus and chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and so on, 70 or 80% of the people with these conditions are women. Now, that's not accidental. It's not genetic, and it's not gender-driven in the biological sense. What it is that women in this society are precisely the ones who, under a patriarchal ethic, have been given the job of suppressing their own emotions and their stresses, and to take on the stresses and responsibility for everybody else. So during COVID, there was an article in the New York Times about how women took on not only their own stresses caused by the COVID situation, but also the stress of their families and their husbands, and they felt guilty that they couldn't meet those needs. And so the article was entitled "Society's Shock Absorbers." And so there's this big medical mystery of why are women more prone to autoimmune disease? This is why. And it's so obvious, but we're not looking at it. It's not the women's fault. It's the social role that is acculturated into them from early onwards. And if I can give you a really dramatic example, in the 1930s, the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis was about 1:1. Now it's 3.5 women for every man. That tells us that it's not a genetic problem because genes don't change in 70 or 80 years. It's the increasing stress on women that is imposing that illness. So this mind-body unity, which has been researched up to yin-yang and has been recognized by insightful physicians for hundreds of years, and now which has oodles of science behind it, is completely ignored in medical schools or in medical practice.
I mean, I'm like such a philosophical person. I'm like, with your time on Earth that's left, if you were able to see the biggest shift in society, like the holistic view in allopathic medicine, let's say, what would that look like? Just for fun in a tiny little capsule.
Well, it would be what has been articulated by others before me, which is that we would look at human beings as the biopsychosocial creatures that they are, not just as biological entities with diseased organs or healthy organs, but as creatures whose biology is shaped by their psychological states and their relationships with society and other people. And then, of course, to have that perspective, one also has to factor in trauma. Trauma, as we've been talking about it, plays such a huge role in people's lives. And so if I could wave that magic wand, it would be that I'd have not just the medical profession, but the educational profession and the social work profession and policymakers recognize the unity of mind, body, social experience, and spirit, which is, by the way, how traditional peoples have always looked at human beings. The difference is now we have the science to prove the truth of what they were always talking about. And so what I would want is I'd want people to become informed by modern science as well as traditional wisdom. That would be the magic wand that I would wave if I could.
That's the dream. I absolutely agree. Here are a bit of my selfish parenting questions. I think they're really important questions for everyone listening. What are your findings on younger children and screen time? And how do we parent, how do we navigate in a screen-filled world?
Well, I devote quite a bit of a discussion to this in this new book. And it's not a question of what are my findings, what are the findings of people that have studied this? And the short answer is that it's a disaster. If I could advise parents, it'd be not to let the kid get near the screen till they're mature enough to make decisions about it, which means no digital toys for babies, no iPad for little kids, no computer screens. Let them play in the dirt with a toy dog or a stick and a puddle of water. Play is what helps the mind develop. We know from studies now that exposure to digital technology actually interferes with the healthy development of the brain. This has been shown on brain scans, that the circuits that have to do with social relationships and independent thinking just don't develop as well under the impact of digital exposure. So my views on that are very, very clear. And if I can be selfish myself, I'll mention a book I wrote previously. I shouldn't say I wrote it, I co-wrote it with a brilliant psychologist friend of mine. It's called Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. And the last 2 chapters in that are about this relationship to the digital world. And we're saying alcohol may be a pleasant thing for a lot of people, but you don't give it to a 1-year-old. And we all think that sex in itself is a good thing, but we don't introduce 4-year-olds to it. So when we introduce something to a child, do it when they're mature enough to handle it. And that's much later than we think. And in a new book as well, I talk about this. So my advice to parents is if I could parent my kids over again, there would not be an unlocked screen in my house.
Amen. And what about, you were just, touching on playtime and how it's so important. What about the connection between playtime and ADHD?
Well, so free play in nature is one of the essential conditions for healthy brain development. And there's very famous and much lamented neuroscientist called Dr. Yak Panksepp, who studied the relationship between lack of play and ADHD. And he saw that there's a real correlation. I don't put ADHD down simply to lack of free play, but we know that play is actually essential for brain development. There's a circuitry in our brain for play. And we can see that with little infants. I mean, how old was your little baby who was now 16 months? How old were they when they started playing with you? Probably a couple of months or two.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, yeah. Engaging.
Peekaboo and all that. Their brain is programmed for play. Given free expression, those play circuits help the intellectual circuits develop properly. So when kids don't get that free, spontaneous, joyful play, that interferes with healthy brain development. And ADHD could be one of the impacts.
Yes. And am I crazy here? I even remember listening to a podcast, I want to say again, like 7 years ago. And you talked about, and I might be getting this wrong, but this is how I digested it or integrated it. Another thing that I think that you were talking about with ADHD is when you're experiencing trauma, at a young age, and it's like stop start, or you have traumatic experience. And then there's a little bit like that. There's something there that really contributes to ADHD as well, right?
Yes. Well, it doesn't even need to be trauma. Now, in my case, as a Jewish infant living the first year of my life under the Nazi occupation in Budapest with the threat of death and deportation hanging over the head of my mother, my father being away in forced labor, my grandparents being killed in Auschwitz. You can imagine my mother's state of mind. So what does an infant do with that much of a stress around him? They tune out. That's a self-protection. They tune out because otherwise the suffering is more than they can bear. But this is when the brain is developing, when essential circuits of the brain are coming online in response to the environment. So the tuning out gets programmed in as your default state. But it doesn't take war or genocide or even severe trauma. It's enough if a mother has postpartum depression and isn't as attuned with the child as she would want to be. It's enough if the parents are economically or socially or relationally or traumatically stressed, so they can't give the child that unconditional, attuned, non-stressed relationship. That child, if they're very sensitive, will have to protect themselves from all the stress, and they do that by tuning out. Again, this is when the brain is developing. So I think, like many other mental health conditions, ADHD begins actually as a coping mechanism that later on, is not so helpful anymore, but at the time it was.
Let's talk about, you've touched on this a bit, but where you activate the same brain circuits, like it doesn't matter what the addiction is, it's activating the same circuits.
Oh yeah, no, this is true for all addictions. So one of the chemicals, the brain chemicals that is involved in addictions of all kinds is dopamine, which is an essential lubricant of our motivation and incentive and seeking and excitement and liveliness, brain circuits and mechanisms. And so whether you're shooting cocaine to elevate your dopamine levels, or you're watching pornography to elevate your dopamine levels, or you're gambling to elevate your dopamine levels, or you're doing compulsive shopping, you're all after that temporary hit of that feel-good, I'm alive, I'm present, I'm highly excited and motivated chemical. So in that sense, there's only one addiction process. It doesn't matter what the target is, whether it's drugs or nicotine or shopping or gambling or pornography or eating or whatever. We're all trying to achieve that temporary hit of brain chemicals that if it had a healthy upbringing, we wouldn't be lacking in the first place.
Yeah. So like, for instance, in this community and in your book, rewiring those, like a lot of ours is neuroscience, and a lot of the work is rewiring, like healing the trauma and rewiring that. I guess my bigger question that I really have just been excited to ask, and I know a lot of this answer, but I think for the public, is talk about some of the really powerful healings you've experienced and witnessed through this journey of people really connecting their trauma and their illness.
Well, so in the first instance, you're talking about this concept or phenomena of neuroplasticity, which is the capacity of the brain to develop new circuits in response to new experience and new circuits that can override the old trauma-imposed ones. And pardon me for this oft-repeated mantra of mine, but I often say, thank God for neuroplasticity, because I'm 78, and I wouldn't want to be as young and stupid as I was when I was 77. So neuroplasticity, as long as we're conscious, it's something that happens throughout our life. Now the question is, what conditions will support neuroplasticity? And well, part of that involves working through your trauma, because the trauma imposes these patterns that keep stressing you. So, for example, my workaholism was based on this belief that I couldn't help but develop in infancy that I wasn't wanted, I wasn't lovable. How could I develop any other belief when my mother gave me a complete stranger when I was less than a year old? Now, she did that to stranger to save my life, but what's the message to me as an infant? What do I make of it? The belief that unconsciously then I naturally I'm not wanted and I'm not lovable. Now, if you're not lovable, go out and make yourself lovable. And how to make yourself lovable, or at least wantable, is to become a doctor.
Absolutely.
Then you're wanted all the time. But it's very addictive because it never satiates that internal emptiness, so that the more you get, the more you want. So that's very stressful to be a workaholic doctor. You're stressing your body, you're stressing your mind, you're stressing your psyche. You're also stressing your family. Once I worked through the trauma that, okay, it's not true that I'm not lovable. I don't have to keep proving to the world that I am. Now I can stop stressing myself about it. Now if I choose to do work, it's because I choose it, not because I'm driven to it. It's because I'm called to do it, not because something in me is pushing me to do it compulsively. So one way to rewire the brain is to work the trauma through. To me, in my world, that's very important. And very few of us can do that on our own. Some people can, but I certainly couldn't have. And so that's one thing. The other thing is, if you're in a relationship, as I have been now with my wife 55 years, the relationship is always a beautiful ground to grow in if both members, or however people are in the relationship, are committed to growth and transformation and truth. So as difficult as many periods of our marriage has been, it has also been my biggest, most important area of growth and transformation, and continues to be. So that's the second point. The third point is there's all kinds of healing modalities out there. There's what I teach, compassion inquiry, but that's just one method. There's what my friend Dick Schwartz teaches, internal family systems. My other friend Peter Levine's somatic experiencing. There's sensory motor reprogramming, I think it's called. There is emotional freedom techniques. There's all kinds of healing modalities, EMDR, brain spotting, havening. You just have to find the right one for yourself. I don't think there's any one that's right for everybody. Fourthly, there's all these practices that I'm sure you and your listeners are familiar with that promote mindfulness, which allow you to notice the old stuff acting up without engaging with it. So mindful awareness practices have been shown to be tremendous supporters of neuroplasticity, which you can actually see on brain scans. So there's lots of stuff out there. Then there's nature. Nature is by nature an experience of harmony that can help to rewire you. Lots of things.
Love it. And we really, it's so fundamental here at To Be Magnetic, a big part of our process. And my last two questions, well, I have a third, my third being very quick, but getting into this one, I think it's really, really a beautiful way to round out the conversation, talking about your healing principles of authenticity, agency, anger, acceptance.
Yeah. So authenticity, we've already talked about. It's that actual need that we have to be ourselves. And the way to approach it is not through some kind of pressure, I have to be authentic. That's not authentic already. It's through noticing where we're not and gently and compassionately asking ourselves, well, what is the belief that I'm holding that has me not being authentic? And how did I acquire that belief? And what is the impact of my inauthenticity? So that's authenticity. Anger, I've already talked about the need for healthy anger. Healthy anger is not raging at somebody. It's not hitting somebody. It's, unless it's self-protection. It's actually just, you're in my space, get out. Whether that person is invading you emotionally, psychically, or physically, healthy anger protects your boundaries, and that protects your immune system, because the immune system is also what boundaries, isn't it? It's to keep out what's unhealthy, to let in what's healthy for you. And it's the same system. It's one system along with the emotional system. They're not different systems. They're just different aspects of the same self-protecting mechanism. So healthy anger helps to support your immune boundaries as well. And the fourth one is acceptance, which is not tolerating the bad stuff, but it's just accepting that right now things are as they are, rather than resenting and resisting. I'm going to figure out what I want to do about it. But in order to figure out what to do about it, I have to accept that at this moment, it is the way it is. And I'm not going to deny how it is. I'm not going to escape into denial. Now, if I had to write the book over it, no, which I don't want to, God, I just finished it. But it took me 10 years, for God's sakes. But I would add awareness as well as the fifth A, which I already talked about, mindful awareness. And it was kind of an omission on my part not to include that, but I would add that as well.
Yeah, I think those are so important, and just so, to me, there's a lot of harmony between those when they're addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that we used to receive, actually, we receive it a little bit less. Our process is hypnosis that's like EMDR informed, and somatic experiencing exercises, bilateral stimulation, etc. So people resource and drop in a little bit easier. But we would receive this a lot with the work prior, and it would be, I can't remember much of my past, and I just really think that you speak interestingly about how our memories show up in other ways when we're triggered, for instance.
Yeah, so we begin with this word memory and remembering. It's true that a lot of people don't recall, but that doesn't mean they don't remember. And it's an important distinction. Recalling means calling back consciously. So you can recall what you did last night. You can recall something a teacher said in grade 5. That's conscious recall. That's only one kind of memory, though. Then there's what's called the implicit memory, which is the emotional memory without necessarily recall for the incidents. So in my relationship with my wife, when I experience or when I interpret, not I experience, but I interpret something as rejection, that's a memory of infancy being given to a stranger. So what I'm saying is that these memories of childhood show up in our personal lives every day. And I'm telling you, whoever's listening, and I'm not the first one to say this, in fact, it's in the Course of Miracles as well, you're never angry about what you're angry about. So if you want to know what your childhood was like, study the question of what you believe and feel when you're upset with somebody in your life. Because 99% of the time, it's going to be some triggered old memory, not recall, but memory. So I have no problem in working with people who don't recall much, because I know that their childhood shows up in how they talk about themselves, in their voice, in their body language, in their facial demeanor, whether they're looking at me or whether they're looking away, when they're upset, what they're pursuing in life, what they believe about themselves unconsciously. These are all based on memory. So those memories can be very easily decoded when looked at properly.
Yeah, I think that's really important for somebody who is on the journey of healing and feeling like they can't recall. I completely agree that life is the perfect mirror that will start to show you that it's usually rooted somewhere.
Yeah, look. I can't recall. I was in Budapest, my home city, just a couple of months ago, and I stood on the very pavement where my mother gave me to this stranger when I was 11 months old to save my life. I can't recall that happening. There's no recall, but the memory of abandonment has been a huge dynamic in my life, so it shows up. We just have to be curious about it.
Yeah, I agree. And then the very last question we ask everybody, that's rather easy if you know, but do you know your sun, moon, and rising in astrology?
You know what? Astrology is not something I know anything about.
Okay.
I'm told I'm a Capricorn, whatever that means.
Yes. Okay. Got it.
People have tried to read my zodiac map or whatever you call it. I could never bend my mind around it. So I have to flunk your last question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, you did well. Capricorn's enough. The audience is like, got it. Fantastic. And tell us, it's so obvious where we can find the book, but what are the best ways to engage with you and when the book comes out and all of that good stuff?
So the book is published September the 13th. It should be available everywhere. I have to confess, I do check online to see how it's doing on.
We see that wound.
And in Canada, 2 weeks before its publication, it's already number 13.
Fantastic.
In the States, it's in the 300s, which is really great, And so you can buy it online, but my personal preference, if I can tell you between you and I, and please don't tell Mr. Jeff Bezos this, but I really do prefer that people should buy books at their local bookstores because the small bookstores are an endangered species, and I think there's such a value. And it's like Joni Mitchell says, you don't know what you got till it's gone, and so many of them are gone. So if possible, buy it locally. My work, I have dozens of YouTube lectures and talks on all kinds of different subjects that have been seen by hundreds of thousands and millions of people. It doesn't cost any money. It doesn't belong to me. I didn't put them up there, but all you have to do is go to YouTube, put in my name. You'll see me talking about addiction, trauma, ADHD, the myth of normal, my relationship with my children, everything under the sun. So that's an easy way to check me out without any cost whatsoever. There's the film that I think you mentioned about my work called The Wisdom of Trauma. That can be watched online at www.wisdomoftrauma.com. Then there's my website, drgabormate.com, where all my speaking engagements and books and sample chapters are available. Again, no cost to anybody. And finally, thanks to my daughter, I have an Instagram presence. And Hannah, who's studying psychology in New York right now, her and I do live Instagram sessions. And we did one last week. It's been seen by about 90,000 people by now. And you can find out when we do them. And then we actually on live answering questions from the audience. And I expect to do an Instagram program in a couple of weeks with my son, Daniel, with whom I wrote the Book of Normal, and without whose help, I could not have written the book. So lots of me out there. You can't miss me unless you try.
Wonderful. I'm so grateful for this conversation and your time. And the book is just like all of your books, just so needed in the world. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
I hope you guys enjoyed that episode as much as I did, we did, Lacey did, the whole team did. It was just so powerful. As Dr. Gabor mentioned, there's many ways to start your trauma work, but if something about the TBM program speaks to you in this moment, one of the first places I would say to dive into is the inner child work, the shadow healing work, and now we have it until the very end of September, so a few more weeks, but the Deep Imaginings will be available after that, is the DIs from our Unblocking Challenge, the SAFE DI, Unblock DI, fear, anxiety, aligned action. Those are really going to help set the stage to start unpacking some of this stuff and some of this work. And also, highly recommend checking out Dr. Gabor's book. I got the pleasure of reading it before this podcast interview, and it is fantastic. It's one of the books that you're going to have on your bookshelf and refer back to it many times over the years. Be sure to check that out. The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. You can find it in the show notes or any local bookstore. Thank you guys, and we'll see you next week.